Hi guys, this is Mrs. Kendall, your assistant principal here at Olympic Middle School. This week in homeroom, you are talking about kindness. And at the root of kindness is the ability to see the humanity in everyone around you, to see everyone as equals. The other day I was outside and only some students from a class had earned extra recess. So I asked one of the students, who's all out here? How'd you guys earn extra recess? And they said, these are the best students. And I pause because I think sometimes we accidentally do that at school. We say, these are the best students, or these are the good students, as opposed to everyone else. And it's really important to me that you know that when you walk through the doors at Olympic Middle School, that you are loved, that you are cared for, and that you bring value. It doesn't matter if school is easy for you or hard for you. I wanted to read you guys a story of an artist named James. James was someone that people thought was too difficult and too different to be around other students, and they missed out on getting to know an incredible human being. I hope you enjoyed learning about James.
Silent Days, Silent Dreams, written and illustrated by Alan Say. James Castle was born on September 25, 1899, on a farm in Garden Valley, Idaho. I think I knew him as well as anyone could know him, which wasn't very much, but I want to tell how I remember him. He was my uncle. James opened his eyes to the world and saw things that moved and things that were still. Anything that moved seemed to scare him. He cried as his parents bobbed around him with darting eyes and flapping mouths. But James couldn't hear himself shrieking. For him, the world would always be silent. Like a small visitor in a museum, he stared at the unmoving faces in frames hanging on the wall. His father was the postmaster of their small community. The castle living room served as a post office and general store. James played with catalogs, books, stamped envelopes, and packages that cluttered the mailroom. One day, he discovered pencils and started to draw. His parents gave him scrap paper to keep him occupied. Soon, James was old enough to start school. On the way there, he stopped at every road sign to figure out what it meant. He never found out, but later he would put made-up signs in his drawings, which no one knew what to make of, so they called them totems. James saw more people than he had ever seen before, all with darting eyes and flapping mouths. From that day, he would always be afraid of strangers. James scared everyone with shrieks he couldn't hear. His father slapped him and locked him up in the attic. "Jimmy's quiet time," the father told the family. One afternoon, when James was let out after a long, quiet time, he looked for a place to hide. He sneaked up into the loft of the unused ice house and saw a living picture framed by the open door. James collected trash paper around the farm and drew on it with burnt matchsticks. He drew everything from memory and hid the drawings in the walls of his first studio. His father tried to make him work on the farm, but James only got in everybody's way. Finally, he was left alone to play while the family worked. They called him Dummy. James couldn't hear, but he saw what it meant on their faces. James spent so much time in the attic that it got to be his room. When his mother put a mattress on the floor, he drew the kind of bed he wanted instead. Then he drew all the things he wanted and put them in an imaginary house of his own. He lined up the drawings against the attic walls. It must have looked like a kind of gallery in there. Nellie, the second eldest of James's sisters, had been born with hearing, but when she was 6 or 7, measles made her deaf. When James was 10, he and Nellie were sent to attend the Idaho School for the Deaf and the Blind in Gooding, about 160 miles from Garden Valley. "17-year-old Nellie turned out to be a model student. James failed at everything, but Nellie told me about the 2 discoveries her brother made at the school that changed him for good. One was the school library, a room with the walls covered with books like gorgeous wallpaper. Then he saw a teacher sewing together a book, the way his mother sewed clothes at home. The woman was making textbooks for her students. Other teachers did the same. James never tired of watching them. For James, I think books were beautiful packages of secrets that he could never puzzle out. So he drew in them to illustrate and put his mark on pages of strange signs and symbols and make them his books. Nellie wrote home, "When Jimmy missed classes, I got notes from his teachers. He liked the library. He couldn't read, but he liked to look at the pretty books. His teachers make our textbooks there. The students read them. Jimmy drew in them." He did the same with other students. Drawing them was his way of making friends. Art classes were given only to the girls. That made James even more secretive. And when the teachers caught him drawing, they were upset. They thought he was making fun of them and the students who couldn't see or hear. They took away all his drawing things. James ran away. Each time he was caught and brought back and made to copy out the alphabets and numerals over and over. The odd thing was that he seemed to like the punishment. He drew them endlessly in the same way he drew everything else. Maybe he thought he was in art class. It wasn't surprising that he eventually invented his own alphabets and signs. James was good with his hands, and he did well in shoe repair class, but the school couldn't teach him to speak. Finally, the principal wrote to Mr. Castle that James was ineducable. He was 15. The principal warned Mr. Castle not to give James any drawing materials at home. He said James should learn to read and write and not waste time on drawings. One morning, as James's older brother, Joe, cleaned the chimney, he noticed James watching him. Later, their mother told Joe that Jimmy had taken some soot in a jar and to see what he was up to. "He's smearing soot with his spit," Joe reported. "He's drawing on junk paper and making books out of them. Craziest looking books you ever saw. All trash. You'd think he's finally learned to read." James drew everything he saw around the farm and decorated his studio with artwork. He drew a lot of imaginary houses with his name on them. By then, James had 2 younger sisters, and there were 7 kids altogether. One time, his brother Joe stole some drawings and showed them to the girls. "He's finally learned his name," they laughed. "Jimmy's dream house. Look, he's made friends for himself." James stayed in his studio to guard it from invaders, and whenever he caught Joe and his friends trying to raid his room, he let out piercing screams and chased them away. And Dummy got his second mean nickname, Crazy Jimmy. In 1923, James's parents sold the farm in Garden Valley and bought a smaller farm in Star, Idaho. All of James's artwork was left behind in the ice house loft. At the new place, James turned an empty shed into his second studio. Mr. Castle died 4 years later. Only Mrs. Castle, James, and his youngest sister Peggy were left at the farm. When Peggy married and had a baby girl, Mrs. Castle sold the farm and together they moved to Boise. Again, all of James's artwork, which he had carefully wrapped in packages, was left behind. In the new house, Peggy had 3 more children. Her husband, Guy, put a cot and a desk and a little wood stove in the old abandoned chicken house for James. Lonely for friends, he made cutout dolls, farm animals, and birds out of cardboard saved from trash bins. He made furniture out of cardboard, even a window, and turned the chicken house into his 3rd studio, which was also his first real bedroom. It wasn't long before the neighborhood kids discovered Crazy Jimmy's studio and trashed it while he was out. After each raid came a terrible scream. Finally, James took an armload of his work and made several trips to the nearby canal. But James liked kids, and he was friendly to anyone who showed interest in his work, even though that didn't happen often. I'm the only one he ever allowed in his studio because he knew I liked to watch him draw. Besides, my mom, Emma, is his next youngest sister, 2 years older than Peggy. Even though he couldn't hear me, I called him Uncle Jim. He never knew my name is Bob. My family moved to Washington when I was 13, and after high school, I joined the Army. I thought a lot about Uncle Jim. There was no use in writing to him. My letters would just be scrap paper for him to draw on. As soon as I was a civilian again, I went to Oregon and enrolled in an art school in Portland, where, to tell the truth, I was just an okay student. The professor didn't notice me until I showed him some drawings that Uncle Jim had given me. He got very excited. "Where is this artist hiding? I've got to meet him." Uncle Jim was going to get me an A from the hardest professor at the school. I agreed to drive him to Boise. I hadn't seen my uncle in 10 years and hoped he wasn't still living in the chicken house. The professor babbled more than usual. He took away examples of Uncle's art and organized an exhibit of it back at the school in Portland. So Uncle Jim had his first one-man show at my school, and he never knew about it. Then a gallery in Portland sold some pictures. Newspapers wrote reviews about the amazing art made by a deaf artist who was completely self-taught. The sales of Uncle's work excited Auntie Peggy very much. Then Bob Clay, the director of the Boise Gallery of Art, heard the news. "They're talking about a local artist," he exclaimed. Mr. Clay visited Uncle Jim at Peggy's house. He brought with him a drawing pad, and soon the 2 men were drawing each other on it. Then Uncle Jim showed him his studio. The chicken coop depressed the director. But the artwork so impressed him that he promised to put up a show at the gallery. He asked Peggy not to bring James to the gallery in his overalls, but was still surprised when he showed up in a silk suit. Mr. Clay said James was the sharpest one at the opening. The turnout was good, and a few pieces were sold. Reporters and photographers hovered around the artist. He stayed long after everyone was gone, looking at his work all in frames, rocking slowly in his new shoes. Peggy was happy when some galleries started selling his work. Then she worried about people seeing where her brother lived and worked. She took him to a used trailer dealer. Uncle Jim drew a picture of Peggy with wheels for feet, which she didn't understand. After a lot of growling from Uncle, she bought him a 2-room mobile home and television, and I heard him laugh for the first time. He could laugh like anyone else. After 30 years in the chicken coop, Uncle Jim finally got his dream home, as the family called it. He worked in it for 15 more years, in the same way he had when I was a kid, drawing with soot and spit on scavenged paper. I think he was happy.